Hello, everyone. Welcome to this first session of the second part of Beyond Bohm, David Bohm and Philosophy. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Barr Center, and I will be your host throughout this series. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so any issues, technical or not, feel free to just let me know in the chat directly. Before I begin, let me just go through a few guidelines for this Zoom call. First, if you can please mute your microphone just to ensure good quality audio and avoid any background noise. But at the same time, we do invite you to turn on your camera, as it's nice to see familiar faces and new ones. The chat will be open throughout the call, so feel free to use it. It's a great way to share your thoughts with the group. Also wanted to announce that we have upgraded our Zoom account, so we do have live subtitles if you want to have them. If you want to see them or hide them, if you go under more at the bottom of your screen, you can choose a setting that you prefer. Finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recording should be available to you in a few days, so you'll get the link once they're ready. So we can begin. As mentioned, this is the second part of Beyond Bohm, which is chaired and organized by Paavo Pylkkänen, where we will be discussing various aspects of Bohm's philosophical thought, such as ideas on philosophy of consciousness, philosophy of physics, metaphysics, and orders. This will be throughout 3 weekends through discussions and presentations with great scholars, some who knew David Bohm personally. Today, to start off this series, we are honored to be joined by the organizer, Paavo Pylkkänen. Paavo is a senior lecturer in theoretical philosophy and director of the bachelor's program in philosophy at the University of Helsinki, Finland. He's also associate professor of theoretical philosophy at the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience and Philosophy in Sweden, where he initiated a consciousness studies program. He has been a colleague of David Bohm and Basil Hiley, and his main research areas are philosophy of mind, philosophy of physics, and their intersection. Today, Paavo will be talking to us about David Bohm and philosophy, an introduction. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Paavo. Very warm welcome.
Okay, thanks very much, and thank you for this also like suggesting this kind of series. Let me see how I'll do this. I can also, here we go. Yes, so and if I do this, now it works. Yes, okay. So we're going to start with this nice picture, which is kind of fits Bohm very well, because he of course, I think in the introduction of his Wholeness and Implicate Order, he says that the aim of his scientific and philosophical work was to understand the nature of movement, and in a way going back to the very beginning of philosophy, with the kind of top problems Parmenides and Zeno were discussing, where Parmenides would say that there were the arguments that movement or motion is impossible, and of course then we had Heraclitus having the other view of saying that reality is movement, and Bohm was of course more on the Heraclitean side. But however, I think one could also see that with some of his ideas in the implicate order, he also had a kind of more static way of looking at things. So we'll maybe come back to that later on. Anyway, and of course some of you know that for Bohm, crossing a street, no, I'm sorry, crossing the river where there were rocks was kind of an insight, where he realized how he has to do it, how he has to, that also has to be a kind of movement. The person crossing the street, he had difficulties with that, and those of you who have seen the film Infinite Potential may remember that story as well. So anyway, here we go. Is it still? And well, of course, I mean, talk about philosophy. I don't know, how, of course, everybody has some sort of idea what philosophy is. And of course, I could spend the entire time here trying to define philosophy. Of course, I realized there's this nice pile of books anybody who wants to find out. So, just read all those things and maybe we get a bit wiser of what is philosophy. Or if you want to take a shortcut, you will read this book by Arthur Danto, which will tell you what philosophy is. So, so anyway, that's just as a starter. Very briefly, just for vocabulary, I thought I'll mention that this is, reflection. This is actually from the Wikipedia, because we were using these words, and if some people haven't studied so much philosophy before, then just that, two puzzles. So you could, this is the common sense view of philosophy. Major subfields of academic philosophy would include metaphysics. Closely related term would be ontology, which is that concerned with the fundamental nature of existence and reality. There is epistemology or theory of knowledge, studying the nature of knowledge and belief. There's ethics, you could say, concerned with moral value, and then logic studies the rules of inference that allow one to derive conclusions from true premises. Now, these are very simple, almost naive characterizations, but just to give, a sense of the vocabulary. And I mean, of course, you'd say that Bohm sort of contributed to all these things, perhaps not so much. He wasn't that much perhaps interested in logic, but certainly these other issues. Another way of looking at philosophy is, we have philosophy of something. So and here are just examples like, philosophy of religion and science. I've added there philosophy of physics just because that would be very central for Bohm, but you could have philosophy of biology. And so that would be another way we could, if we start discussing about Bohm and philosophy, we could then talk in these terms, like, what was his contribution to let's say, well, it's quite obvious he had made a contribution to philosophy of physics, also the philosophy of science, but then some of the other fields, like, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, he certainly did work in those areas, but it's still more difficult to see exactly what his contribution was. Okay. But I just thought I mentioned some philosophical problems that are kind of both very common, but also in a way, I think there is a connection to Bohm's work as well. So that's already the one I mentioned at the beginning, about, we could ask about the universal reality, that whether it's sort of still or sparkling. The question of, for example, is reality a kind of process or movement, as of course it goes back to Heraclitus, but this is, other people like Whitehead and but also Bohm have emphasized that sort of process philosophy. And if it's not process, then what is it then? Another theme would be the question of atomism, where we could ask, well, is everything made of its parts?
Oh, I think Paavo's signal is dropped. Hopefully he'll come back soon.
But of course, people like Bohm, looking at more the holistic implications of quantum mechanics, would then question this and perhaps sort of emphasize that maybe there's a sense in which the whole is primary and not kind of reducible to its parts. And there are contemporary philosophers like Jonathan Schaffer, who has also written, I think he calls it priority monism. But this would be, of course, one of the important questions. There's the question of determinism that actually Mari van Sterian will be talking about Bohm and determinism. I look forward to to her talk about, because she's, of course, a lot of people may think that Bohm was a determinist in quantum mechanics, and Marie's talk in this series will be that, why Bohm was never a determinist. So that's going to be interesting. But anyway, this idea there is there are many different ideas of determinists, but perhaps one that has been strong in our culture is associated with classical Newtonian physics. where the idea is that if we know, the initial conditions of the particle, where the particle is and its movement or momentum, and we know the forces that prevail, we can then predict the future, but we can also calculate the past with Newton's equations. So it appears as if everything is really determined. I've just put it in this way: it's the future predetermined, but and from there we could construct a problem with the free will, saying, well, if the physical world is deterministic and if the human mind is reducible to the physical brain, does this mean that there is no free will? I mean, apparently this was the question that was extremely important for Immanuel Kant, one of the major philosophers. And it's one of the reasons why Kant actually decided, to suggest that the physical world is like a phenomenal world. It's not sorry. Yes, yeah, well, yeah, the world of physics is there's a sense in which it's not the ding on six, it's not the reality as it is. It's more has to do with the phenomenal world. And in this way, Kant was hoping to save room for free will, which would then operate in if you like, in the world as it is itself. Or this is again kind of a simple way of putting it, but just to show how important some of these questions have been to the philosophers of the ages. Well, from there we could move on to another problem, mental causation. That's actually something where I did my own PhD connected to this issue a few years ago. And so it's a problem of mental causation. And there we could ask, well, if mental states are non-physical, as actually many philosophers suggest in one way or the other, that they would be non-physical, how could they possibly influence the physical actions of our body without violating the laws of physics? So one of the common assumptions in contemporary philosophy is that the physical domain is causally closed. And that really means that if something, event has a cause, you should be able to describe that entirely in physical terms. So there's no room for no need for mental, but also no room for genuinely mental, non-physical causes to operate in the physical world. This is in some ways also connects to the Descartes dualism, where Descartes defined matter and consciousness as completely different. And so that's where we in a way have the Finnish philosopher Georg Henrik von Wright said that we're still in the shadow of Descartes, and we still have this dualist tradition, dualist kind of shadow over us, in the sense because many philosophers they're not happy to say that the mental is nothing but the physical. But then if you keep them separate, then you have a problem of how to connect them. And in a way, there was this Descartes scholar, John Cottingham, I once heard a talk by him, and he said that what's typical of philosophers is that at the beginning of their career, they make a distinction, and then they spend the rest of their lives trying to bridge that distinction. And he said this is definitely true of Descartes, who early on separated mind and matter, arguing that they're completely different, and then he still, he was in various ways trying to connect them in his work. Anyway, and from there, we can also move to the problem of consciousness, something that many of us have been very interested in. And we have Bill Seeger in this series who'll be talking about consciousness and the way, Bohm's work could connect there. Here, the problem, you could say, is formulated like asking, well, how can the objective mechanical physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective holistic conscious experiences? And this is, of course, an old problem, but these days it's called the heart problem, a term that David Chalmers, the philosopher David Chalmers, coined. It was earlier there in the work of people like Thomas Nagel and others. And that again is something that actually Interestingly, when I interacted with Bohm, I mean, I got to know him 1980, but perhaps more closely around like maybe 84, 85, and then until he died in 92. And we had a lot of discussions about the mind and matter, but not so much about conscious experience. Conscious experience became kind of big in the early 90s. So in a way, it's a shame that it would have been interesting to see how Bohm would have kind of responded. I mean, he does address conscious experience in parts of his work, but it's not like, when we were discussing, we were talking about things like cognitive science, maybe a little bit about like mental causation, but just various ideas in cognitive science, and not so much worrying about this problem of experience. But it's certainly, you could definitely say that late 80s, early 90s, this has been the most important question in philosophy of mind. And I guess in my own work, I have tried to kind of address the problem of consciousness also from the, if you like, in the Bohmian framework. And but of course, it's not easy. I mean, that's why it's called a hard problem. That, whatever approach you choose, it's not even the Bohmian approach, it's not, at least not for me, easy to see how you could how could you make kind of significant progress, but can always try. And let me see. Well, there are some further philosophical questions. I mean, another thing we could always ask, well, can we ever know reality as it is in itself, or are we necessarily limited by our human perspective? For example, our forms of perception, such as space and time, or our categories of understanding, like causality. I mean, this is kind of a Kantian question. And of course, this is very much a question that if even in philosophy today, this would be still one of the key questions, and it's partly about realizing that as human beings, we necessarily have that perspective of a human being, and our dream, perhaps in science, may be that we some people think that with science we find out what is the nature of reality as it is, if you like, independently of us, or perhaps even independently of any something like a human perspective. But I think the Kantian insight was that we at the very least we have to take very seriously the kind of limitations that our own the structure of our mind puts to our possibility to understand, if you like, the real world or the objective world. And of course, then we can always speculate that. I think even Kant speculated that the possibility of another kind of understanding that we have, but I guess he felt well, we as humans we wouldn't be able to understand that. I guess another kind of related question is the question about what is the relationship between appearance and reality. Maybe in so-called naive realist might say, well, appearance is the reality. So the real world, the world in itself is the way it looks to me. But then of course we can easily come up with examples that can't quite work. I mean, if you put a stick into water, it will appear to be bent, while we know that it's not. So appearance can be deceptive. Two railway lines, when you look at them, they touch each other at distance, but then again we kind of know they do not touch. And so the distinction between appearance and reality seems sort of quite fundamental, and that is actually a question that also kind of interested Bohm, and in a kind of a funny way, because I think, well, those of you who know Bohm's work, I think many of many people here do, I think one thing that's kind of very characteristic of Bohm is his attempt to provide ontological models and go beyond appearances, go beyond what can be perceived, and that, as we will see perhaps a bit later, I mean, that was often the point of even in the so-called causal interpretation he published in 1952. The idea was to go beyond what we can observe and make a model and hypothesis about it. So that people would call him like a realist, a scientific realist, in the sense that that it's meaningful to talk about unobservable phenomena. But if you read The Undivided Universe with Basil Hiley, I think toward the later chapters there, I think Bohm wants to discuss some, philosophical notions, and he kind of starts almost like saying everything is appearance, which sounds like pretty much the kind of opposite of what we think he might say. And I guess the point he wants to make there, that even in physics, we can always go deeper, study deeper, but whatever we will encounter will be an appearance to us. So he's sort of taking that philosophical path that other philosophers have taken. And I remember actually then I was in London at the time they were writing the book, and I was reading the draft, and I actually asked him, so if everything is appearance, what's, they were calling their interpretation an ontological interpretation. So the idea was that they wanted to give us not just appearances, but actually an ontology. And so I think Bohm went home, and then I think he came the next day, and then he kind of qualified this thing by saying that our appearances can reflect reality at a certain up to a point, but still you would find a deeper, if you like, another appearance if you study further. And but anyway, it's a typical, I'm just taking that as an example, that there's this kind of tension that also I think if you study Bohm as a philosopher, you will actually find out, I mean, you will discover that he, although it might appear that, he would be kind of taking the so-called realist position in philosophy, there would be also, he would be pulled by the other view. Like in this case, he would actually, rather than emphasize reality, he actually ended up emphasizing appearances. So it's just as I don't know if I could almost say it's a kind of a warning, maybe a study guideline for anybody studying Bohm, that you should be prepared that he in many of these questions, it's not at all black and white. He could change his mind and take the other point of view, in some sense perhaps reflecting this sort of dialectic materialism and background which he had in philosophy. Anyway, but we could say more about this question, but I think it's still interesting to maybe for some of you. And I've added there a question: what is meaning? Now, maybe philosophers perhaps don't always write it like that. I mean, in philosophy of language, we will talk about various issues connected with meaning. I think for Bohm, at the time when I interacted with him, meaning was very important. I mean, maybe I'll say a bit more about it later on. I have another slide connected to that, but anyway, so that was really important for him. And finally, I think here we could say that if you look at contemporary discussions in philosophy, many problems constitute the place of some apparently non-physical entity or aspect, whether it's mind or mental states or intentionality in the sense of aboutness, consciousness, meaning, in the physical world. And so sometimes we call this like natural, can we naturalize meaning or naturalize the mind? Can we, because people there, I think in contemporary philosophy, in much of it, there's a very strong sense that the natural sciences provide us the correct picture of the universe. But then there are these aspects such as, you know, mental states or conscious states that don't seem to be, they don't seem to be physical in the same way as, you know, most other things are. And this then creates this kind of tension, and that's, you know, philosophers write a lot about these things. So that's maybe just as a more general point. If you want to navigate the philosophical research, then you will probably find that. So, anyway, so so let's see. I mean, I don't have too many slides, but maybe I go through just a little bit more, and then we'll see how we do it. So there are some, and there's also a little bit of repetition here. So but I'll move on now. I think one thing we could say about Bohm philosophy that he developed already since the 1950s, what we could call a new metaphysics based on the base of quantum theory and relativity. And if we look at that in terms of contemporary philosophy, we could say that he was practicing scientific metaphysics or revisionary metaphysics, where I mentioned Ladyman and Ross there. 2007, they published a book called Everything Must Go, where their idea is that what kind of science is often about is to actually discover structures, and those structures are more fundamental, and relations, and those structures and relations are more fundamental than the things between which relations prevail. The things we might call the furniture, and you know, so they would say that the relations are more important than the furniture of the world. And there's a sense in which actually Bohm's work fits quite well there. The term scientific metaphysics just means that when we do, you know, what philosophers have been doing, figuring out, you know, the basic structure of the world or nature of the world, we should actually take very strong guidance from the sciences. And not all philosophers like that at all. I mean, I think there are some philosophers who would say that there's a sense in which philosophy comes before scientific enterprises, or, you know, natural science presupposes certain things that philosophy studies. But I think it's fair to say that at least to some extent, Bohm represents a kind of scientific metaphysics. But and then again, the Peter Strawson called this like revisionary metaphysics. Alternatively, we could, you know, instead of trying to change our worldview on the basis of natural sciences, we could actually study more, you know, the structure of our mind in, let's say, in the Kantian fashion. That would be another way of thinking about it. And again, as already mentioned here, that I guess if you would ask contemporary philosophers, then Bohm is known especially for the so-called hidden variables interpretation, which then could argue is the first consistent realist and determinist alternative to the Copenhagen interpretation, which emphasized the role of observation. And so actually, John Bell coined the term beable as an alternative term to the observable that's what's used in standard quantum mechanics. And so so again, here we can see the Bohm as kind of going beyond a more positivist approach that was there in this quantum theory as when it was developed. And of course, a lot of people thought, well, accused that Bohm wants to return to classical physics. but I think it's quite clear that that's not a case, because there are some strongly holistic and contextual features in the Bohm interpretation. And so it's not the, it would be a mistake to see it as just a return. Here is actually this slide made by Basil, which summarizes this Bohm's 52 theory quite neatly. And I think it's just showing how it, those of you who know the mathematics, and I mean, just shows how you get it out of the Schrödinger equation. Perhaps kind of philosophically interesting is that in many, before the Bohm theory, it was very common to say that we cannot explain the two-slit experiment, something we've seen here. Whereas one thing that the Bohm theory seems to do is to actually provide a model and an explanation and description. Now, important thing here is to realize that what we see here, this is the experiment where particles come from the left, they come to through its holes. And if it was classical physics, they should go in straight lines. And the real puzzle in quantum mechanics is, well, why do we get these funny trajectories bunching in this kind of way? And here one is explaining it by saying that there is this quantum potential that provides the difference between classical physics and quantum physics. In this real part, if you will take away the Q, you would get classical physics. And so so here, of course, one could then argue that the Bohm theory manages to do something that standard quantum theory does not, namely make a hypothesis about what might be going on. We cannot observe these, these trajectories, these individual trajectories. And so that is important to remember, that this is like a hypothesis. So it's not even it's an appearance made theoretically. It's a guess about what the reality behind appearances might be like. Okay, but we can always come back to this, but I won't spend too much time at the moment. And again, as many of you know, is that already in the late 1950s, Bohm began to develop a more general framework in which one could bring together quantum theory and general relativity. And there was a notion of reality as a discrete structural process. And this later on, it was characterized and developed in terms of a notion of implicator and folded order. And this is something that tomorrow Petteri will be talking about it with, I'll be interviewing him, and Petteri Limnell, who is, so I won't go too much, but I just say a little bit about it. Here we have the furniture, there the explicate order. So our everyday perceivable reality is an explicate or unfolded order. And it appears to us that everyday objects persist, are continuous, they're just there, right? But now what Bohm claims is that according to quantum field theory, all the elementary particles out of which chairs, tables, and other physical objects consist are, strictly speaking, momentary manifestations that unfold from an implicate order that prevails in the movement of quantum fields. And so he would say they endure only for some time, and while they last, their existence is sustained in a constant process of unfoldment and re-unfoldment. So this notion became very important for Bohm, and he kind of offers that as if you like a world picture, or you could see that as a kind of a metaphysical view. And so so the and we'll be talking a bit more about this but perhaps for now I'll just remind some of you. I put here some also some like personal let me see now what happens here, sorry. I'm just having a bit difficult with the Zoom here because it's hiding. I have to move things around. Okay, so I thought I'd just say something about the personal memories about Bohm and philosophy. because as I mentioned, I first sort of met him in 1980. I was like in my 20s, and actually I was at the time myself quite interested in Krishnamurti, and I actually met Bohm in that context. And of course, there this question was, transformation of consciousness. I mean, this is a question Krishnamurti was asking, that could there be a change in human consciousness? It's a kind of course, it's a kind of thing that people might describe as some sort of enlightenment, but Krishnamurti had his own version of it, which Bohm found very interesting, and which I also found very interesting. I guess I was in my late teens, and Bohm was much older when he encountered Krishnamurti. But that's something that we had an interest we had in common, and we would often talk about it actually until the very end. And I once commented to Bohm that here maybe we were supposed to discuss physics or philosophy or cognitive science, and here we were again talking about Krishnamurti. So I just mentioned that to Bohm, and Bohm said, well, that Krishnamurti has touched our heart. He has touched our heart. So I guess that was a nice way of describing that. And of course, that is Krishnamurti was no academic philosopher. Of course, his background was in theosophy, and then I'm sure had some other influences, but the and he didn't even like academic philosophy too much. He maybe just felt that the sort of thing he wanted to do, which was perhaps more like change, looking for some sort of change in consciousness and society. Then academic philosophy wouldn't be that relevant. But of course, looking back at it, I think this whole notion that I think one of the aims that Bohm and Krishnamurti had was, they were very interested in things like self-deception and whether we could be free from self-deception. And that obviously would be very important for doing philosophy or doing science. I mean, if we think that our purpose in science is to find the truth, so anything that would help us would be relevant. But of course, perhaps in a deeper sense, also we could say that consciousness or our mind is the instrument that we use in when we do philosophy, when we think about problems, the kinds of problems I mentioned. And of course, if you actually could change, if there would be a way of changing our minds, I don't know through what, through meditation or through some sort of what Bohm would call proprioception of thought, or some sort of self-awareness. I mean, who knows? I mean, that could actually, at least it's conceivable that it might change the way we think about these problems. But I won't go into it, but I just want to mention that it's kind of potentially important also even for academic philosophy. But I don't know, perhaps not too many people have explored that idea. Now, I think in the case of Bohm, this kind of interest also led, as we know, he was interested in communication and dialogue. He was actually very interested in those things because, at least I think back in 1987, Bohm was visiting in Finland, and I was with him in a physics conference in Joensuu. And Bohm was, I guess he didn't like some of the talks that much. And he said to me that the almost like reflecting on his life, 87, what was he, 60 years old? No, 70 years old. So he said that he might actually not, he was almost like regretting that he went into physics. And then I asked him, so why do you say that? Then he said, well, physicists don't care about me. I guess he felt that there were just people are putting up all the equations and there was no discussion of what the equations mean. And that was, he was actually already, and then he said that actually already in the late 40s, he felt like that, 1940s. And he actually wanted to do something else, but then he didn't realize what else he could do. And so then he decided to write this book called Quantum Theory, which came out in 1951, where he tried to do something, add something to mathematics, namely what quantum mechanics means. But then he said also, well, yeah, he couldn't find an alternative, so he continued with the physics. And then I asked him, so what would have you done then? I mean, you know, if you didn't do physics, then what? What would be the alternative? And then he said, well, you know, I would have studied communication and things like that. So it's quite interesting. I mean, of course, it's easy to say that after having done brilliant work in physics for many years. Who knows? Maybe. And but his work in this communication dialogue is. Many of people here have been part of it. And I can say that, for example, in Finland, there are quite a few people, even in government organizations, that have taken up the Bohmian, part of the Bohmian ideas of dialogue. So I think he would be very happy to see that. And this is sort of quite independently of my work. I mean, I did talk about these ideas of dialogue already back in the 1980s when I returned to Finland from but there are other people independently taking them up, and so I think it's a kind of live issue, at least in some parts of the world still, and of course extremely important in today's world. We're seeing all the problems that we're having at the moment. So and that's definitely, again, it's not a sort of issue that in academic philosophy many people are thinking about that, but I'm thinking maybe one should, and I might myself even try to do something in this area, maybe a conference or something like that. Anyway, but let's move on. But I just want to mention that this was clearly Bohm's kind of one of his key interests, at least, you know, during the 1980s and during the period when I interacted with him. And so, but of course, there was the implicate order. He published the book Wholeness and Implicate Order in 1980. You know, there was the holographic paradigm. It was a bit like kind of a new age thing, partly. But then there was Karl Pribram. You know, there was also, not only was the universe, physical universe holographically organized, which means like in this implicate order where each part, in a sense, contains the whole. But even the way memory is stored in the brain might be that way. Now, whether, you know, that idea may not be correct, but of course, you know, neural networks, artificial neural networks, where you can actually see the implicate order principle also operating. But that again was, I think, the implicate order is a sort of theory that I think many physicists still don't understand or know about it, and even philosopher of physics. It's quite rare. But I think the more general public really found that still imaginative, or it kind of touched, I guess it may have touched the heart or mind of many people. So I think it's more better known in non-academic circles. I don't know. Anyway, but another thing that Bohm was working on the early 80s was something he called sum of significance. And we actually did together a little meeting called Meaning as a Key Factor of Being. And there was an anthology, Search for Meaning, that came out of it, which I edited at the time. I guess it's 1989. And so and Bohm saw there that these ideas could actually provide a new approach to the mind-body problem, or, you know, the relation of mind and matter. And he even connected his causal interpretation, you know, his own 1952 theory, to that by suggesting that the kind of active information plays a causal role in even at quantum level. There's another question that we discussed, you know, in the Wholeness and Implicate Order. This, I think, is chapter 3, is known as Reality and Knowledge Considered as Process, and which is kind of, you see, it's interesting in the sense that if we say that, I guess the way Bohm might put it, he said, what does it mean for one part of reality to know another part of reality? What kind of relation is knowing? And of course, then if the thing that you are trying to know is static, and if the thing with which you know your beliefs are static, then you might establish some sort of correspondence and of course we in philosophy we think of traditionally knowledge as true justified belief. And then, how do what is it that makes it true? It might be sort of correspondence between our propositions and the state of the world. But Bohm actually didn't. I mean, he had a much more, I guess, rather difficult to understand. But this is when I was doing my PhD. Then I would talk to Bohm also about quite a lot of these things, and I would writing about these things. So it's in the end, I think he was suggesting that he took an example that which you may, asking if you ask the question, well, how does knowledge work, or what is the nature of knowledge? That with the honeybees, and especially if they have no food, and then one honeybee encounters food somewhere, then that honeybee can go to the group and through a dance indicate where the food would be, and then that way they can all go there. So there's a kind of communication, perhaps even consciousness. I mean, I once talked to Donald Griffin, who studied honeybee his entire life, and he would be happy. He wouldn't be against the idea that they might be conscious. But anyway, but for Bohm, he felt that maybe even human knowledge is a bit like that it's a sort of an activity that can, through which we navigate, or which can guide us in our life in this reality, and it actually comes quite close to kind of pragmatism in philosophy, which is again interesting in the sense that if you read some of Bohm's work, you might just think that, well, he's just realist and sort of. So some of these things were actually quite surprising. But anyway, I leave that. But I just thought I even mentioned a bit of the personal side, because that sort of influenced also quite a lot of the things that I ended up doing then after Bohm died. Let me see, how do I get here? What else do we have? Okay, I think I'm just wondering, I've been now going on for at least 45 minutes, whether we should, I don't have too many slides left, so maybe, shall I just finish and then we can discuss and go back? I'll go through very quick. It's also perhaps a bit of a repetition, bit of a summary. So, what we have, I guess it's by now clear that Bohm was interested in a number of philosophical questions and made many philosophically relevant contributions. And again, you see, on the one hand, you see Bohm's work in physics would be relevant to all those philosophers who are interested in metaphysics and ontology and foundations of physics, especially what I call scientific metaphysics. If we feel that as philosophers trying to understand the world, we should listen to what the natural sciences have to say, then Bohm would be one of the important physicists to listen to or try to understand. And again, there are some questions here, like, can we make those hypotheses? Can we go beyond observations? And also this question of determinism, that, are individual quantum processes indeterministic in some absolute sense? I think Bohm showed us that they need not be. But anyway. And again, if you look at all his work, he really explored extensively philosophical issues such as the nature of science, knowledge, meaning, language, communication, perception, mind and matter, consciousness, and so on. He was interested in everything. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, and it was almost like, I don't know, sometimes I feel that maybe he had no choice. I used to know another person a bit like that was the Finnish philosopher Jaakko Hintikka, who was also tremendously, he was very productive, and he worked in the wide number of fields. And somehow even with Hintikka, I felt that he had no choice but to explore other things. So I'm not saying that it's a curse, but it's it's almost like, for the rest, many of us, we take our time, we work for a while on a topic, and then we can go and have fun and do other things. I think in the case of Hintikka and Bohm, perhaps they wouldn't necessarily do that many other things. I'm just saying this in the sense that it's over. If you really look at it, what some, all the discussions that Bohm was having, it's overwhelming. I mean, and there are a lot of, he would write letters. I mean, they've been published with Biederman. I edited one volume that. Jeffrey book came recently, and there's this tremendous amount of exploration. And of course, people who wanted to study Bohm, there would be still much work to do. I mean, just to trying to understand, maybe even see if there are some valuable insights there. And but then again, the Bohm's philosophical contributions are not widely known or appreciated among professional philosophers. And of course, we could ask, well, should they be? And or is it just like we have physicists and who also then want to explore philosophical issues but I want to answer this. Maybe this whole series may hopefully give us a bit of because we have different people looking at Bohm from different sides. But I could mention as an example Bohm's real mode experiment with language. Some of you may know. I mean, I think the idea there was that I think they partly motivated this experiment by saying that it's very difficult to talk about measurement in quantum mechanics, because we typically, when we think about measurement in our everyday world, we have one entity A trying to measure another entity B using some other separate entity C, which is kind of a subject-verb-object structure. Whereas what Bohm and I think highly were feeling that in quantum mechanics, this even measurement is this undivided process, and this goes really back also to Niels Bohr, that the quantum of action is indivisible. So it makes it all difficult to talk about it. It has more a nature of a process, and that's how Bohm felt that, well, our current language emphasizes the subject-verb-object structure and maybe implies that the world is made of these separate entities. What if we introduce a new mode of language where we give the word a process, fundamental, even in our language and thinking? And this is, you see, it's very radical. I think most philosophers, I met one philosopher, Paavo Pylkkänen, who actually thought it was very interesting. I think many philosophers' language would just, look for the rubbish bin if you show them anything like the real mode, because they just feel, well, I think it's so paradigm laden. There's a linguist, Maxim Stemanov, who really is very excited about, and he's written about the real mode and suggesting that this is, nobody ever thought about anything like this. Now, I don't, I'm not a linguist, a philosopher of language, so I don't really know, but that's something where I could still feel that it would show that perhaps sometimes a person coming from another field will not be restricted in the same way as let's say, philosopher of language might never do anything like this, because they maybe Wittgenstein said that you shouldn't do that, or it would be stupid to try to do anything like that. But anyway, I leave that as an example. Sorry about that. Okay, and the just a few examples more here. If you think of the work in physics, you see even the textbook quantum theory, that I don't know, that's maybe like 600 pages, and of course it has quantum mechanics in it, so there's a lot of equations, but there's a lot of explanation as well. of the meaning of quantum theory and also an attempt to provide a physical picture. And already there you can see the quite strongly coming of this idea that the physical universe is in some sense an undivided whole. I mean, this is a theme that persists even in Bohm's later work when he, worked with on his own interpretation with Basil Hiley. Interesting for metaphysics, he gives a fundamental role for potentialities. So, and you see here, Bohm is still within the Copenhagen interpretation, okay? And here, so here what he is saying is that before measurement, we don't actually know what an electron is. And we know that we cannot measure position and momentum simultaneously, accurately. That connects with the uncertainty principle. So what are they? You see, in classical physics, we have the idea that the position and momentum of a particle can be measured at the same time. But in quantum mechanics, they can't. So how should we think about them? Should we think about that the electron has a well-defined position and momentum, but we just can't reveal it? Or more radically, as Bohm put it here, is that maybe before measurement, some properties like momentum and position exist at potentialities, but they're opposing in the sense that if you, in the experiment, explicate one of them, the other one will not be shown, or vice versa. So that's kind of quite interesting also, sort of philosophically, and for metaphysicians talk a lot about potentialities. And this connects, of course, with in the Copenhagen interpretation, Niels Bohr, with the notion of complementarity, and which is connected with the idea of implicate order. Because even in the idea of implicate order, the idea is that there's only part of reality that is explicate at any moment. There's always much that is implicit, and in that sense, cannot be made. It's a bit like Wheeler said that time is nature's way of making not everything happening at the same time. Only the present, what is happening the present moment. But it's not everything. And the rest could be, for example, potentialities. And it could connect to these, of course, maybe the Aristotelian ideas. And we have the final lecture in the series by Maria-Liisa Kakkuri-Knuuttila, and she will be talking about Aristotle. Perhaps not exactly on these topics, but maybe we might even touch some of these questions then. Anyway, another very interesting thing in this book is that in the very end of the book, Bohm actually points out that, you see, we might think that in quantum theory, okay, quantum theory is about the little thingies, and then from those little thingies, we make our big thingies. And therefore, there's a sense in which quantum theory would describe more general reality. And then in some situations, from there, we could get our macroscopic world. But that's actually not, this is where something very interesting in standard quantum mechanics. Because remember, in standard quantum mechanics, there is no model of what the electron is when it's not being measured or observed. And so that's why actually the Copenhagen quantum theory doesn't give us what is needed to construct macroscopic objects. It doesn't give us particles. This is something that Bohm then 1952, that's what he then, when he comes up with his theory, the causal interpretation, that's where you do have a quantum ontology from which you can derive classical ontology. I'm just mentioning that as something that is rather interesting, and he articulates very well this feature of the usual quantum mechanics. Those sort of questions are are interested in physics, that because you see, even our measuring apparatus is at the classical level. Part of it has to be, the needle. But the usual quantum mechanics doesn't really give us the needle. We just have to presuppose that there's a needle, which we then use to make we use the apparatus to make measurements about the quantum world. But I leave that, I just mentioned that. Yet another philosophical interesting is that Bohm doesn't really talk very much about epistemology or knowledge or those kinds of things, but he does suggest that there are analogies between quantum theory and thought. And that's, again, opens up a new picture of the human mind. I've written about that myself to some extent, but there's of course a new field of quantum cognition where people have developed actually make use of the tools of quantum theory to make models of various mental phenomena or cognitive phenomena. It's quite vibrant field. Again, here with the hidden variables, and as we mentioned, it would show the possibility of well-defined ontology and determinism, and then in later development there would be new properties that are emphasized. And so you see, I think we're getting to the end here, but you could say that, for example, this Bohm's 52 hidden variable work is relevant for philosophers' science because first, we could ask, well, what does it mean to say that a theory has interpretations? Some physicists don't like that, actually. There's been a lot of dogmatism in quantum mechanics, but they just see, well, you've got the mathematics and maybe so this is one issue. Again, you could ask something, when Bohm came up with his theory, 52 theory, a lot of people were saying, well, it doesn't make any new predictions, therefore let's ignore it. And but then others said, like Jim Cushing said, well, but if the Bohm, in principle, you might have invented the Bohm theory before the Copenhagen view in quantum mechanics. Should we then say, well, the Copenhagen should be thrown away or ignored because we already had the Bohm theory? So they call this historical contingency. It's like who gets there first wins the game, but it's, is it really like that? And so, so this is the question whether there can be a value to an interpretation, a new interpretation, even if it doesn't make new predictions. And actually, of course, Bohm did discuss possibility of new experiments already in the 52 papers. There are other questions like what's the role of intuitive and intelligible models? I think the intelligibility will come up with maybe both Bill Seeger and Maria-Liisa Pakkuri-Knuuttila. And again, I already mentioned this question of explanation, that to what extent does the Bohm theory explain? Perhaps also the whether we could understand Bohm's interpretation in terms of Kuhn's paradigms. Feyerabend and Kuhn had a bit of disagreement about the Bohm theory, where Feyerabend was kind of accusing Kuhn of the way he was, responding to this Bohm's 52 theory. And Kuhn replied that it's not that he doesn't necessarily think it's a good, interesting theory, but Kuhn just felt that if Bohm cannot come up with some sort of new experiment or result, he will not be able to convince the community. And Thomas Kuhn felt that science is very much a community affair, that the progress or change in science comes only, it's a bit like a political revolution. It's only when you lose your faith in the old paradigm through some things he called anomalies, but also when the new rival is able to, convince people. And that's, again, something that, of course, if we look at historically, if we look at the Bohm's 52 theory, the way it has been received, that's, of course, very interesting to test various models in philosophy of science, how well they would explain what has actually happened. Let me see if I still have there. Okay. But anyway, so these, I've already mentioned the implicate order, so I won't say about that. Finally, perhaps also saying that how the implicate order already anticipates this idea such as space-time as emergent, and also the this ontic structural realism seems, which is quite popular today, it seems quite similar to the implicate order. But I think I've said a lot, and I think I'll leave those things. So I think this is the time to stop. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Paavo, for this wonderful presentation. We can start opening up to everyone. If you'd like to make a contribution or ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, which can be found under reactions at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can always write your question in the chat and I can read it out to you. So who would like to go first?
James, I had a question in the chat. This is Joy. I'll just ask that. Some people came up with ideas. So I was wondering, when you said that Bohm said that, was it physics or physicists that did not care about him? Was that what you said about that?
Well, I think there was a period when he published his alternative interpretation that it seems a lot of physicists didn't respond that well. That's it's hard to say. I mean, he did get a lot of attention to the theory in the end, I think. But I think he felt that he was being ignored. And I think if you read the biography of by David Peat, I think he will describe there those kinds of receptions, and it's hard to, you see, it's always difficult to see why. One thing, of course, was that because Bohm he was kind of associated with communists or the left, so and of course that got him into trouble with the McCarthy era. So that's always one possibility. And perhaps later on with the when he got interested in Krishnamurti, then maybe some people, some physicists again felt that somehow puzzled about that. They couldn't quite understand what he was doing. But I think, yeah.
It was when he was at the conference that you were at in Finland?
Yeah, no. What he was saying that in that conference, it was more that he was frustrated because he felt that too many people were putting too many equations and not really. He just didn't find that terribly interesting. I think he was more interested in the ideas.
I see. Okay.
And that's why and then then I asked him, so what? And then he said that if he could make a decision now, perhaps he wouldn't go into physics. And I was quite puzzled because, I of course admired him very much as a physicist. And so that was quite a thing to say. And so I asked him, well, why not? And then he just said, well, physicists don't care about meaning. And of course, these are my memories. It's what, 35 years ago. So one has to be careful. But still, I mean, some things sort of stick. At least I think I remember.
Yeah. Okay. So he was suggesting that other physicists didn't care about him. I wasn't sure.
No, not about him. No, sorry. At that particular occasion, he was just feeling that physicists don't care about meaning. They are not interested in what things mean.
I see.
Whereas he was interested his reason maybe to go into physics was to look for some understanding, and whereas he felt that physics had been kind of deteriorated or reduced, this kind of activity where people do calculations and they go to a conference and they have 10 slides, or at that time I guess it was overhead plastic of showing lots of equations, going through the equations, and then there'll be the next talk. And he just I think he just felt this boring and superficial, and And I also remember in that particular conference, some of the people were coming up with rather wild ideas. And I think his comment was that about some further theories, and he felt that we don't even understand non-relativistic quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And we should be careful then, if we don't do that, then what will come out of all the other stuff. So he also felt, I think he had a feeling that because people don't care about the meaning of the theories, whatever is being done, there's a great risk that it's going to end up being rather superficial and not good physics in his standards. But he has said that already, you see, because when he worked in the more mainstream physics, he worked in plasma physics and a theory of electrons in metals. That's very important for mainstream solid state physics. And so when he said, when he later on went to a conference on plasma physics, he again felt there that there was no discussion of the ideas, that it had kind of deteriorated more to just more like just looking at the equations rather than the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like he was quite driven by meaning in everything.
Well, that seems to be the case, that he felt the physical. That's like when he said that the reason why he wrote this 1951 book was because he wanted to help also students to understand quantum physics. And a lot of people actually still like the Bohm book. I mean, I read it a few years ago. I mean, jumping over a lot of equations, because there is mathematics in the book, of course, but it's still, it's an interesting book. And I feel that even today, like 70 years after, people still find the book useful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for coming in. We have a question from Tala.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. I have trouble unmuting. I guess my question, and it's just going to be a very direct question. I hope you don't ask me to expand, because I will probably have a hard time doing it. But what, in your opinion, how did Bohm view chaos? Was it, I guess my question is, when human is faced with something that we call chaotic, I have a sense, based on my own readings of his philosophy or physics, whatever you call it, I have a sense that he found some level of order in chaos, or he believed we are able to find some order in chaos. So my question is, what do you think his thoughts were about chaos?
Yeah, that's interesting, because let me see if I'm getting an echo, maybe. Okay. Yes. Well, of course, there's this chaos theory as an area of physics, and actually, I think David Peat kind of discovered that Bohm wrote a paper already in the 50s, maybe with Schuster or something like that, where they anticipate some of the ideas of chaos theory. So, I mean, he had, in that sense, no difficulty with some of those ideas. The question is how much they developed it, but it's rather interesting that they were at least moving toward the direction of some of those ideas. I mean, it's, for example, in chaos theory, what's with some systems that are in a very unstable state, a very small change in the initial conditions will produce hugely different results. And so I think he was kind of aware of that. There has been some discussion about whether you could have chaos in the Bohm's model, in the Bohm 52 model, because it is a deterministic model. So then, people have written about that as well. But maybe in a more general philosophical sense, Bohm, I think you're correct in saying that Bohm thought that there would be an order even in what we call chaos, or And I think it's particularly, I remember that in the discussions Bohm had with Finnish physicist Kalervo Laurikainen, because the Finnish Laurikainen was interested in the German physicist Wolfgang Pauli. And Wolfgang Pauli emphasized the irrational aspect of reality, which then we could see, for example, in the single quantum. And so both Pauli and Laurikainen felt that this in a way it goes beyond rationality and somehow beyond usual science. And Bohm didn't like that idea of irrationality at all. So I think he would then associate it maybe even with something like the Nazis or you know, some sort of chaos in this kind of very, very destructive sense. And that I feel that he definitely had a preference for the rational and order, and I guess in that sense you're quite right.
Thank you, Tara, for coming in. I have a couple of questions in the chat. So I'll start reading one from Patricia, who asks, could you talk a little bit more about Bohm's ideas about meaning and how that relates to the mind-matter question?
Okay. Wow, but it's of course a very big topic, but I mentioned this notion of soma significance, and there the idea is that one would say that each somatic soma is same as matter, right? Each material configuration carries a meaning, at least potentially, if not actually. So any physical thing can act as a symbol, depending on it. You know, if we could decide that some configuration is meaningful, means something. But then what was important for Bohm was that meaning is active. So if something means something, if I read a newspaper, I don't have to eat the paper, I abstract the forms, and if those differences of form make a difference of content to me, then that can give rise to activity. If it says in the newspaper that, you know, those who come to the store before 10 a.m. will get iPhone X for half the price, okay, then I'm, you know, if I want an iPhone, I will go there. But more generally, the whole idea of the meaning as being active, and the idea that meaning is something that sort of organizes physiological processes. And of course, for example, in Bohm's favorite example was that you're walking in the dark night. You've heard that there might be a dangerous assailant in the neighborhood. You see a suspiciously looking shadow. And if you interpret it, then you're assigning meaning. If you interpret the shadow as danger, then there will be what Bohm called a synsomatic reaction, where adrenaline will flow and other things will happen in the body. And this again is something that I think when philosophers talk about meaning, they very rarely consider these kinds of things. And I think that was one of Bohm's kind of insights, that to realize this role. He also called this like, you know, information is typically active. And I guess that's an idea that I also found very truthful and useful, and I've been studying that myself, or anyway, been thinking about that a lot.
Thank you. I'm wondering, along with that, if you see, the way I've been thinking about it is that meaning is like a common denominator between our thoughts and our manifestations. So different dimensions of our experience and meaning is a common denominator that like you said, organizes, but it kind of helps to hold us all together into a whole being. Do you think that's an accurate view of Bohm's work, or have I taken advantage and extended it?
Well, no, but I guess Bohm would say something like that culture is shared meaning. So I guess this whole notion of shared meaning would be important. And I think also in this dialogue experiment, which he suggested, the idea is that as people are engaging the dialogue, then they will build up a common pool of information, a common pool of meaning. So I think in that sense, it would be kind of crucial for society. I mean, we're always going to have diversity. We're always going to have different meanings, each one of us. But what we can do is to try to see sort of unity in the diversity, which would be still kind of necessary. So I guess in that sense, meaning both separates and unites us. It separates us because we probably, each one of us will think will mean that we mean somewhat different. The meaning will be somewhat different to each one of us. But of course, there's the possibility of sharing as well and communicating it.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. We'll next go to Manfred. Oh, you're still muted, Manfred.
Now?
Much better, yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Do you hear me? Great. So the problem I have for some years with Krishnamurti and with Bohm is if on the basis of life is an undivided whole, how could I try to understand this undivided whole? So for me, as deeper I go in thinking, as more there's a chance that I'm ended in a paradox. And as I see it now, we have to let stand this paradox as it is and not try to solve it. For instance, when Bohm says everything is appearance, and at the other hand, he says there is an implicate order which cannot be seen. So that is, for me, it's a direct contradiction. And when I've learned that I have to work with this kind of contradictions, it makes sense to me. So also the Copenhagen interpretation and the Bohm interpretation might have sense as long as we don't try to bring it together. But what do you think about it?
Oh, you're muted now, Paavo.
Myself, so that yeah. You see, one thing about the implicate order is that, of course, we commonly think that the implicate order is sort of hidden, and Bohm Bohm would also say that the explicate order is what we typically perceive with our senses. So you might even try to define explicate order in terms of what is perceivable. But interestingly, Bohm also does say that we can directly experience the implicate order. And that happens when we are listening, for example, when we are listening to music. And so in that sense, the implicate order is not a non-empirical notion, or it's not merely a metaphysical notion. But of course, with contradictions, I think Bohm was, of course, his favorite book in philosophy was Hegel's Logic, and where you then have this idea of negation and negation of the negation, and this whole kind of dialectical this idea of dialectics. and I think he does in his, for example, the book Wholeness Implicate Order, he plays with those kind of contradictions, like thought is non-thought and non-thought is so. I mean, if you want to get into it, so I think he maybe saw that as some sort of a going, you know, I guess it would be fair to say, I said in the beginning that Bohm was not necessarily, perhaps not so interested in logic of contributing, but I guess he was playing around with this dialectical logic and these contradictions and the way they could, we should think about them. So, but I don't know. I mean, I guess paradoxes are, of course, extremely interesting in philosophy. I mean, Zeno's paradox. This is something that Bohm felt that he perhaps might even solve with the notion of implicate order. It's not easy to understand how he solved it. I mean, in Finland we have some, also there's like a musicologist, Timo Lai, who has been thinking about these things a lot. And but I'm sorry, I can't say that much about other than that those paradoxes come up there, and of course they are, from the very beginning of philosophy, of course, have played an important role and are still there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manfred. I'd like to go again to the chat. Kathleen has an interesting question, which I think we've touched on with Manfred's question, which is, given all the areas Bohm explored, what would you say about his level of interest in the practical application of his work to the human experience, to living day by day, the day-to-day?
His level of interest in practical. Well, I think he was, of course, very, very interested in that because I think he took extremely seriously this his interaction with with Krishnamurti and all the guidelines or you know and of course Krishnamurti was all about how you live your life and very little about academic philosophy or anything like that. So I think and maybe one there should also remember that Bohm was a quite committed socialist, or perhaps even a communist in his in the 50s. And even when some of his friends were kind of throwing in the towel, he would still stick to the ideology. And I mean, this is something we learned from the biographies. But then I think at some stage he got disillusioned. Maybe it was the Rutzev revelations in 1956 or something like that. Then Bohm kind of lost. Maybe he kind of realized that communism is not going to be the solution in the way he hoped that it would be. And I think there maybe one of the reasons why he got interested in Krishnamurti was that he felt, well, if communism doesn't do it, what does do it? And this whole idea of that maybe there should be a change in human consciousness, and even a transcendental. I think it's also, as many of you know, Bohm was also a religious person, but not in the usual sense that believe in God, which is like in Christianity, at least in a superficial sense. In Christianity, you emphasize a lot that you gotta believe. But I was actually just maybe a couple, after a long time, I was listening to there was some sort of program, documentary or whatever about Krishnamurti and Bohm, where Bohm was saying that there is, the brain has to respond to this intelligence. The brain on its own would be very mechanical, but when you have this intelligence, then you would get intelligent action. So I think so. And he felt that this would also, it was kind of a transcendental view in the sense that this is something beyond the brain, if you like. But he felt that this would be also solve one of the main problems of religion, which is dogmatism, because the kind of religion Bohm was advocating, or the kind of intelligence he thought might be there in the universe would actually help us to be free from things like dogmatism and self-deception. Now, whether or not that's possible, I don't know, but I mean, he seemed to, go for that idea. And I think so I think for him also I think he worked a lot on himself to and maybe saw that as necessary, that if we're going to make the world a better place, then that I think he felt that would be absolutely necessary. And then he would need to have this dialogue in a way that people would still need to be able to communicate and sort out their different meanings. And so I don't know. I mean, the question about practical application, again, you see, I mentioned that Bohm was working on everything. So he was trying to solve a human problem. He was trying to find a solution to the problem of individual well-being, through this change of consciousness, but also to our problem society through this dialogue. I could say much more about this, but I guess that's enough.
Thank you, Paavo, and thank you, Kathleen. We'll next go to Sue.
Thank you. This has been really wonderful. I was wondering, as you talked about the theories and his quantum potential material, which I'm somewhat familiar with, but it occurred that I'm in a dialogue group, and we've noticed that by applying those basic guidelines of no assumptions and no agendas and suspending judgment, it occurred to me, maybe when you're doing that, it allows for the thoughts that are in the dialogue to flow in a different way that simulates, in a sense, that finds the quantum potential, the hidden field that allows your consciousness to go further outside of the collective consciousness back into something larger. Did he speak about that at all in terms of why he created those guidelines with that in mind, perhaps? It seems to be what we're experiencing.
Interesting. Well, I think you could try to think of various analogies between the physics and society, and of course he was doing that, and some people actually didn't like it. I remember when he was in Copenhagen giving a talk there, in the audience somebody was very critical. I think they call it sociophysics, and they felt that it's not the right way. We shouldn't use these ideas from physics to describe social interactions. And I guess Bohm defended himself by saying, well, physics is general and it applies everywhere, and it's our worldview. So he feels that it's necessary that it will help us to have a coherent view of reality and perhaps even ourselves. So he was kind of, but of those things, again, I think we have to be careful in the sense that things like the quantum potential those are actually rather difficult to understand. I think Basil Hiley is at the moment working very hard trying to see, maybe understand in a deeper way what the true meaning of the quantum potential is. And I guess especially if one doesn't know the mathematics, then all we do have is some of these characterizations. For example, Bohm would say that it contains this active information, it will organize the activity, and there would be these common pools of information. You would have like a quantum potential for a group. So maybe something analogous happens with meaning as we communicate, but whether or not where do we get from there, then I think I don't know how much the physics will help us there. I think maybe it's then another level where we have to experiment, and it might help, but it might also lead us astray. I don't know.
It's interesting because it seems like as time has gone on, our topics for this dialogue have moved more into the cosmological world, and they were very basic ideas 10 months ago, but now we're talking about math and the universe. And people who don't even read David Bohm in this group are going into places in their consciousness that they've never gone before. So it's sort of intriguing as an observer to notice that. And I used to read a lot of Krishnamurti too, and I'm thinking about, this practicality of how do you live your life in a more conscious way, how that may be folded into dialogue in just the way it's organized. Yeah, it's intriguing. It's quite intriguing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So don't see hands up, but may I ask a question for you myself, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
So I know you touched upon a little bit during your presentation about sort of the progression of science, the evolution of science. You mentioned Kuhn and paradigm shift. So could you expand maybe a bit more on that? Because I know that also Popper's falsificationism is probably more of the mainstream thought on the evolution of science. So what do you think Bohm's thoughts on that? And also if maybe you can touch upon where we're at the moment with the evolution of science. Are we reaching a breakthrough? Are we reaching a paradigm shift? Yeah, the current situation of science. I think that's my question.
Very good. Yes. Yes. Well, I remember I did ask Bohm about kind of a Popperian question about suggesting that the problem with his theory is that we cannot falsify it. And he didn't, of course, like the idea at all. So he just said, well, it's very easy. If I make a statement that there's a rubbish bin outside the door, then I can test it. It's very easy to falsify. But when I'm trying to deal with figure out what might be happening at quantum level or even deeper level of reality, then it may not be a good idea to be restricted with ideas that you can test immediately. So I think that was his idea, was much more that we should develop our ideas and kind of protect them. There's a philosopher of science, Lakatos, who had maybe more ideas like that. There are some core ideas that you don't need to question. Those are like the core assumptions of your research program. But of course, I think Bohm, at the same time, he was suggesting possible experiments and hoping that in the end tests, because that's, of course, if we look at history of science, then tests are important, and there have been some kind of falsification and those like things. I also think he did like Kuhn. He wrote a review of Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, kind of fairly favorable. But at some stage, I think, and this is in the book he wrote with David Peat, Science, Order, and Creativity, I think they also there see the paradigms as being harmful, or at least there's a danger that, which means that people are, you see, one thing is that in philosophy of science, we could describe the way science works. And perhaps to some extent, this is what Thomas Kuhn was trying to do through historical studies, and but then the other thing is, of course, that we could be more normative and say, well, how should science work? And often people take these things, they don't keep them separate. I think a lot of people have taken Popper's idea of falsification as more the way we should do science. And one criticism is that if people had followed that in the history of science, we wouldn't even have classical physics, because even Newton's theory in the beginning had some problems that they were evidence that falsified it. So, but at the same time with Kuhn's paradigms, it's tricky in the sense that Kuhn felt that there are these long periods of normal science, and then at some stages there are these anomalies, and you get a crisis, and then you may get this revolution. And Bohm felt again that if people actually feel this is the way we should do science, this can be very harmful, because then if people come up with creative ideas during so-called normal science, people will ignore them and say, well, because Kuhn said, or the paradigm, this is the way science works. I mean, how do we know how science works? So of course here I think there are sort of intermediary views. There are views that yes, falsification can be important, testing is important, but we should allow also for, you know, ideas that cannot be now falsified. Paradigms play an important role, but they can be also very harmful. So there's, I think Bohm was kind of seeking a middle way, and they're describing that quite well in the book Science, Order, and Creativity. But then the question about how is science like today? And that's a tricky one. I think we see some features that we see is that in empirical science is that the way funding, the kind of research funding creates, like almost every day, if you follow some email lists or whatnot, social media, internet, somebody will come up with a great new results, and then in the end of the day, quite a few of those may not really be that significant. So I think science has also this. I think we entered kind of a new era where it's rather difficult to see whether there's real progress. What I tend to do is I read some popular books. I recently read a book called The Gene by, I think the author is Mukherjee. Excellent. That is really an excellent book. In some ways very sober and also very critical about the progress of genetics and all the claims that have been made. There's another book about the brain. I forget by whom it was. I think we do have those kinds of writers who try to give a realistic picture of the state of the art, let's say, in things like neuroscience or genetics. But you have to look hard for them sometimes, because researchers typically, they want to hype their research, they want to sell it, and it's probably a bit different than it was let's say, you know, 20 years or 30 years ago, and in that sense we are in a new situation. And to summarize, I think it's difficult to see, you see, how much real progress we have made in those fields. Probably less than a lot of people claim, but certainly some, and it's not yeah, I think it's to be seen. I think that would also be another topic and would need quite a bit of thought to really answer that probably, but these are just some little
ideas. Also asked because my grandfather David Pete, who spent a lot of time, you know, big part of his life being a physicist, I remember him giving talks at the Power Center in person saying, if I had to redo it again today, I probably wouldn't be going into physics because it has become stale. The physicists, I mean, mainstream physicists at least, are very stuck in their old ideas, and it finds a lot of resistance breaking those barriers. Now, I know there are loads of physicists out there who are not like that. You know, we have the series, The Future Scientist, which looks just at that. But yeah, I feel like it's hard to have these breakthroughs or these paradigm shifts if we get stuck in those old ideas. Like, I know obviously Planck and Einstein had resistance when they first proposed their ideas, even Newton to a certain extent. But yeah, would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, I think some of the interesting things are, for example, there's this thing called FQXI, Foundational Questions Institute, which has gathered a group of really brilliant researchers, quite multidisciplinary. I think it started with cosmologists, like people like Sean Carroll and Max Tegmark, but they've kind of extended it to include more. So I think FQXI, they got a website, and so I think there are, and of course, you know, in the field of consciousness studies, there's been quite a lot of interesting research for the past 30 years, both a kind of soft side, more soft, you know, in the sense more holistic, this kind of thing, and then perhaps a more hard line, you know, neuroscience approaches. So I think personally for me, I don't sort of regret going into philosophy and these fields. I get all I regret. Of course one hopes that one would have achieved more, and it's easy to push in the future that you do that tomorrow, yeah, right? But I think there's still many interesting things to do. But the other thing is, of course, to get funding for that interesting kind of work. So I mean, like, you know, I have PhD students, and I think it's a big worry to try to get funding for more philosophical projects, because that's then when you meet the reality that what kind of projects do get funded, and perhaps especially in even philosophy has become very specialized. So if you want to have a career in philosophy, maybe you have to do a theory of knowledge. A lot of people will say, well, it's extremely boring, but they do it anyway because that's the way to get the money. But that's not the idea of, I think in some ways the idea in philosophy, you should do the things that are interesting. And so this is what I think is, personally, I'm reasonably happy, but I'm kind of, I do find it very difficult, this the system and the way research is very specialized, and in some sense, maybe even in neuroscience, people end up just, you know, because we have these tools, we can measure various brain processes. So people spend their lives in some sense in something that can be intellectually quite sort of not very challenging. And then that's our theory of the mind, you know, when we go, you know, we report the results that, you know, this part of the brain activated when I'm saying this, and somehow we end up discussing perhaps not the sorts of questions that would take us deeper.
Thank you, Paavo, for answering my questions. I think we've got time for maybe another one. Just with some requests in the chat to read out this question, which came from Hugh, who asks, what do you infer David Bohm would have made of gravity as a basic ordering process? Thomas Berry had it in the great work that gravity contained an expansive force and containing force, the wild and the disciplined.
I don't think I can really answer that question. I don't really know so much about what Bohm thought about gravity as such. I guess he was hoping that this implicate order framework, he could include gravity in it. But I think that might be a question for Basil Hiley.
Sure, no problem. Don't see any more hands up, unless. Sally, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a brief thing. Hi, Paavo. It's a long time I've seen you.
Right.
Yeah, well, one of the things that interested me that you said about David Bohm was that lots of philosophers do their stuff and then they go home and have fun or bath the children or whatever, but that this was his life. This was the whole thing. So I don't think he broke all these things up, his interest in art or in philosophy or in science. He kind of lived it. And as I understand it, Einstein felt relativity or had dreams. I seem to think somewhere I've heard that Bohm felt the quantum in his muscles and so on. So I kind of, when somebody asked about how this applied to life, I suppose I wanted to say my sense of him was he lived it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you'd say about that.
No, absolutely. I think this is the thing that, of course, it may again be that a lot of people don't realize that how much time and energy he put into this. Like when he had the, you know, I think he met up with Krishnamurti in around 1960 or so, and he really took that as a sort of a and wrote about that a great deal as well. So definitely he was trying to do it. And I think the people who knew him, of course, sensed that very much. I mean, I don't know. I mean, of course, it's dangerous to build any kind of personality cults or anything, things like that, which is easy to do with the kind of a charismatic person like Bohm or perhaps especially Krishnamurti. But I would say definitely with Bohm that he was quite an amazing person in many ways, in ways of trying to kind of solve problems. So look at things in the be kind of fair and search for the truth in the various situations. I mean, of course, nobody's perfect. I think you can find examples, where it didn't work for him. But I think on the whole, he did quite well in those terms. And I think a lot of people who knew him really found that quite rather amazing. That because of course in science, we have all kinds of ego trips as well, and there's a whole spectrum of behavior in science, and I guess Bohm put a lot of emphasis in trying to also find a kind of a morally or ethically way. Also because I felt that that's the only hope for humanity. And but these are of course the questions that we're still left as 30 years. I guess it's 30 years since he died, and the world was in a mess then, and it's perhaps even in a worse mess at the moment. And so all the work, those kinds of things that he was working on, I think we should still be working, maybe in another way, in our own way, but still I think it's very easy to forget about that level of work and just focus on some of these other escapes, whatever they might be. Philosophy.
Thank you, Sally, for coming in. So we only have a couple minutes, so maybe we should start closing. Paavo, do you have anything to leave us with today? And if you want, maybe even something about what's yet to come for the rest of this series?
Yeah. No, firstly, thanks very much. It's always rather exciting, this kind of series. And in Finland, we have the summer holidays. I'm in my summer house, and so trying to get into this. So it's nice to see so many people here, and also many old friends, and so this I really enjoyed this today, and about the rest of the series. So tomorrow, then Petteri Liminal and myself will be continuing, and of course Petteri has really done many things with. He's actually, I can see him. he did his master's thesis on time process, and he, we go back a long way, and he has really been thinking about these things, and he has perhaps some, I don't know how much we go into that, but he knows a lot about the philosophers mentioned like Kant, but also Schelling, and but we will be focusing on issues like the implicate order and the generative order, coming to the question of creativity that was rather important for Bohm. So that'll be tomorrow. And then there'll be actually a 2-week break, but then we will continue with, then Petteri will be like interviewing Basil Hiley about what Basil thinks was the role of philosophy. Of course, sometimes you feel Basil has, he does the experimental work, but and especially the mathematics, but not so much philosophy. But then again, he's been interacting a lot with philosophical ideas, and that'll be exciting to see what Petteri and Basil will come up with. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it because I'm in. There's actually somebody taking a PhD on Bohm and theology in Helsinki that I've been supervising, and actually Maria-Liisa was one of the examiners. And so we got a party that night, so I can't be there on that 2-week Saturday. But then a Sunday, I think we'll have Bill Seeger on talking. I think probably talking also about panpsychism and things like that. And then Saturday after that, there'll be Marie von Strien. She has written excellent articles about Bohm and things like causality and Feyerabend, and really how to understand Bohm's earlier work in relation to later work, and I look forward to that. I haven't actually heard her talk before. And then in the final session with Maria-Liisa Kakkuri-Knuuttila, there'll be kind of an Aristotelian, and I'll be with her at least the final session. We'll maybe do that together from my office in Helsinki. So I hope that we will learn a lot during the series, and also perhaps for for people give you ideas and inspiration in whatever you're doing, connected to these things. That let's hope that there are many good questions, and also we can have this interaction here, and in a way keep up the good work that we kind of are lucky to have encountered.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paavo, for this wonderful session, a great introductory to what's yet to come. And thank you everyone for joining us, of course. Thank you for your questions, both in chat and by voice, or even just by being there. We're all very grateful for you to join us today. Before we go, I would like to invite you again to tomorrow's session, where we'll have Petteri Limnell interviewed by Paavo, talking about creativity and the generative order. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a forum, a discussion forum, where we can talk about the ideas discussed during these sessions out of hours throughout the week. If you haven't already, you should be receiving an invitation to this, which is called Sutra. And please do contribute there, share your papers, material, or anything you'd like to share there. In the meantime, you can always contact us on our website under the contact us section, or via email. You can email Eleanor@partycenter.com to contact her. So thank you again, Paavo. We'll see you again soon here at Party Center.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.